During World War II, Canadians were asked to sacrifice more than just comfort and convenience. They gave up foods, ingredients, and even favorite recipes, trading abundance for survival. But in kitchens across the country, families refused to let rationing take away their meals. Instead, they created some of the strangest dishes you could possibly imagine. From pies with no apples, to coffee with no coffee, these were the forgotten meals of wartime Canada. Welcome to the Canada we remember. Today, we'll journey back to the 1940s, when food rationing and shortages changed how Canadians ate forever. Some of the recipes were clever, some were desperate, and some, well, they might just shock you. Yet each one tells a story about resilience, creativity, and the ways ordinary Canadians made the best of hard times. So join us as we count down 25 strange foods Canadians ate during World War II. And as you watch, think back to your own family traditions, and ask yourself, would you have eaten these dishes if you had no other choice? Point number 1, mock apple pie, made without apples. Imagine sitting down at the dinner table, the smell of freshly baked pie filling the room, only to discover there isn't a single apple inside. Historical background/context. During the Second World War, apples were not always easy to come by in Canadian kitchens. Rationing, transport shortages, and the focus on feeding troops overseas meant fresh fruit was a luxury that many families simply could not afford. Yet dessert was more than just food, it was a sense of comfort, a taste of normal life in the midst of uncertainty. So, homemakers across Canada got creative. Using crackers, sugar, water, and a dash of cinnamon, they baked what came to be known as the mock apple pie. The crackers softened during baking, absorbing the syrup and spices, and remarkably, the texture was close enough to mimic apples. Why it mattered in Canada? For families, this pie was more than a clever recipe. It was proof that even in times of shortage, tradition could live on. Sunday dinners still ended with pie. Children still enjoyed dessert. And mothers and grandmothers across Canada passed down a quiet message of resilience, that even when the world was at war, life at home could still hold sweetness. Emotional or shocking twist. But here's the strange part, many children of that era grew up believing they had eaten real apple pie. Only later did they realize their childhood memories were built not on fruit, but on Ritz crackers. For some, it became a nostalgic reminder of wartime ingenuity. For others, it was a recipe they swore never to eat again. Of course, apples weren't the only thing missing. Point number 2, powdered milk everything. Milk, the symbol of childhood, health, and comfort, became something entirely different during World War II. For most Canadian families, the milk on the table didn't come from a cow. It came from a tin. Historical background/context. Fresh milk was heavily rationed during the war. Much of Canada's dairy supply was redirected to feeding soldiers overseas and supporting Britain, which relied on Canadian shipments to survive. What remained for households was limited, and often expensive. To fill the gap, the government encouraged families to use powdered milk. Sold in boxes and tins, it could be mixed with water and used for everything from coffee to baking. For many Canadians, it became the backbone of daily meals. Pancakes, cakes, soups, and even baby formula often relied on powdered milk instead of fresh. Why it mattered in Canada? This substitute became a quiet symbol of wartime adaptation. For mothers trying to nourish their families, powdered milk offered consistency when fresh milk simply wasn't available. It allowed Canadians to keep baking, to make porridge, and to send children to school with something close to the nutrition they needed. Advertisements of the time even promoted it as a modern, patriotic choice, a way to do your part for the war effort. Emotional or shocking twist. But for those who grew up on it, the memories are mixed. Many recall the thin, watery taste and the strange afterflavor that never quite matched the richness of real milk. To some, it tasted like sacrifice. To others, it was a comfort, the familiar taste of childhood during uncertain times. Even today, older Canadians will tell you, once you've had powdered milk in your tea, you never quite forget it. Smooth transition to next point. And while milk was replaced with powder, meat faced its own transformation. The answer to Canada's meat shortages came in a can, and it would shape wartime dinners in unforgettable ways. Point number 3, wartime spam and canned meat creations. It may surprise you to know that one of the most famous foods of World War II never saw the inside of a butcher shop. It came sealed in a tin, salty, rubbery, and endlessly recycled into Canadian dinners. Meat was one of the first essentials to be rationed during the war. Fresh cuts of beef, pork, and chicken were redirected to soldiers and allies overseas. At home, Canadians were encouraged to make do with alternatives. Enter Spam, the canned meat product from the United States, along with other varieties of government-issued canned luncheon meats. Cheap to produce, easy to ship, and shelf-stable, these tins quickly became a fixture in Canadian kitchens. Homemakers transformed them into fried Spam slices with potatoes, Spam casseroles, Spam sandwiches, and even mock meatloaf. Recipes circulated in women's magazines, showing families how to stretch a single can into multiple meals. Why it mattered in Canada. For many families, these tins represented survival. They guaranteed a source of protein when fresh meat was impossible to get. In rural areas, where supplies ran short, they were a lifeline. And for children growing up in the 1940s, the salty taste of canned meat became as familiar as bread or butter. But not everyone was a fan. Veterans returning from overseas often swore never to touch Spam again, having eaten it almost daily while serving abroad. Even today, older Canadians joke about the war years diet and the countless ways their mothers disguised Spam to make it edible. For some, it remains a nostalgic reminder of resilience. For others, it was a dish they'd gladly leave in the past. Still, not every wartime substitute came from a can. Sometimes, bakers found ways to stretch staples like bread, creating loaves that were far from ordinary. Point number 4, Victory bread, stretched with potato and oats. Bread, the simplest comfort food, became a battlefield of its own during World War II. And in Canada, a slice of bread didn't always come from flour alone. By the early 1940s, wheat flour was heavily rationed. Canada, as one of the world's largest wheat exporters, was sending vast amounts overseas to feed Britain and Allied soldiers. What remained at home was carefully controlled, forcing Canadian families to find new ways to make the most of their flour. Enter Victory bread. Instead of being made entirely from wheat, this wartime loaf was stretched with fillers like oats, barley, cornmeal, or even mashed potatoes. Cookbooks and government pamphlets urged homemakers to adopt these recipes, praising them as patriotic choices that conserved wheat for the war effort. Why it mattered in Canada. Victory bread wasn't just about nutrition, it was about morale. Bread had always been the centerpiece of Canadian tables, a food that symbolized stability. By creating Victory bread, Canadians felt they were doing their part. Every sandwich packed for school, every slice buttered at breakfast, became a quiet contribution to winning the war. The bread itself might have been heavier, denser, or less flavorful than traditional loaves, but it filled stomachs when it mattered most. For children, the taste of Victory bread was unforgettable, coarse, chewy, and sometimes tinged with the flavor of potatoes. Many joked later that it was half bread, half mystery. Yet for families, it carried pride. Each loaf was a reminder that sacrifice wasn't just happening on the front lines, it was happening in kitchens, too. And when even bread grew strange, other vegetables stepped in to fill the gaps. One humble root, the turnip, became a surprising star of wartime Canadian dinner. Point number 5, turnip stew, the poor man's dinner. What if the vegetable you dreaded most as a child became the main course of dinner, night after night? For many Canadian families during the war, that vegetable was the humble turnip. During World War II, potatoes, a Canadian staple, were often rationed or redirected to the military and overseas allies. When shortages hit, families turned to turnips, which were cheap, widely available, and easy to store. Stews made with turnips became one of the most common make-do meals. With a few scraps of meat or sometimes no meat at all, homemakers would simmer chopped turnips with onions, carrots, or whatever they had on hand. The result was filling, if not exactly appetizing. Wartime cookbooks even included special Victory stew recipes where turnips replaced potatoes entirely. Why it mattered in Canada. For working-class families, turnip stew was survival. It filled hungry stomachs when other ingredients were scarce, and it stretched tiny amounts of meat across large households. For children growing up in the 1940s, turnip stew was as common as sandwiches, a dish that appeared on the table far more often than they wished. Yet, it represented resilience. Families could still sit down together for a hot meal, even in the leanest year. But the memories are mixed. Many Canadians who lived through the war grew to hate the taste of turnips, associating it with poverty and hardship. Some swore never to eat them again after the war ended. Others, however, carried a strange nostalgia for it, remembering the smell of their mother's kitchen, the warmth of stew on cold nights, and the feeling of family togetherness, even in the hardest times. Of course, vegetables weren't the only food transformed by rationing. Even something as simple as eggs, once taken for granted, came in powdered form, changing the way Canadians cooked breakfast forever. Point number 6. Powdered egg omelets. Imagine cracking open your morning eggs, and instead of a golden yolk, you're staring at a scoop of yellow powder. During World War II, fresh eggs were a luxury. Much of Canada's egg production was shipped overseas to feed Allied soldiers and support Britain, leaving little behind for families at home. To fill the gap, powdered eggs, dehydrated, boxed, and shelf-stable, were introduced. They came in tins or packets, and all you had to do was add water and stir. The result could be scrambled, baked into cakes, or whipped into an omelette. Government pamphlets promoted them as modern and patriotic, urging Canadians to embrace this substitute. Why it mattered in Canada. Powdered eggs kept Canadian kitchens functioning. They allowed families to continue making recipes that required eggs, from pancakes to puddings to birthday cakes. For soldiers abroad, they provided a concentrated source of protein that could survive the journey overseas. At home, they represented both sacrifice and ingenuity, a way to maintain tradition even when the real thing was out of reach. But for anyone who grew up with them, the taste was unforgettable. Powdered eggs had a distinct, slightly sulfuric flavor and a texture that never quite matched the fluffiness of farm-fresh eggs. Children often wrinkled their noses, while mothers tried to disguise the taste with extra butter or seasoning, if those were available. Some veterans later joked that powdered eggs were more memorable than the war itself. For many, the first bite of a real egg after years of substitutes was a moment of pure joy. And while eggs were replaced with powder, even fish had its wartime imitator. Canadians got creative, turning rice and seasoning into what they called mock fish. Point number 7. Mock fish, made from rice and flavoring. Picture this, you're promised fish for dinner, but when the dish arrives, not a single fillet is on the plate. Instead, it's rice, carefully seasoned to pretend it came from the sea. Fish, once plentiful along Canada's coasts, became harder to find on ordinary tables during World War II. Much of the supply was shipped overseas to support troops and allies, while transportation bottlenecks made it scarce inland. For families far from the ocean, mock fish became a surprising solution. Homemakers boiled rice until tender, flavored it with fish stock, onions, herbs, or even a splash of vinegar, then shaped it into patties or loaves meant to resemble fish. Wartime cookbooks published government-approved recipes for this substitute, often suggesting it be served with white sauce or vegetables to make it more convincing. Why it mattered in Canada. Mock fish was not only a replacement, it was a lesson in thrift. Rice was cheap, filling, and stretched further than expensive fresh fish. For households with limited rations, it provided a way to put a fish dinner on the table without relying on actual fish. It also reinforced the wartime spirit of resourcefulness, showing Canadians that with creativity, even rice could mimic the flavors of the sea. For children, though, the illusion didn't always work. Many remembered the disappointment of biting into what looked like fish, only to taste seasoned rice. Some families embraced it as a clever trick, while others recalled it as one of the most unconvincing wartime dishes of all. Even today, older Canadians laugh about how far their parents went to make rice into something it could never truly be. And when even fish was imitated, some Canadians turned to the simplest of standbys, a slice of bread with whatever they could spread on it. For many children, that meant one unforgettable wartime staple, the ketchup sandwich. Point number 8. Ketchup sandwiches. For many Canadian children of the 1940s, lunchtime didn't mean ham, cheese, or even peanut butter. It meant 2 slices of bread, with nothing inside but ketchup. Meat was one of the most tightly rationed foods during the war, and cold cuts were often out of reach for ordinary families. Butter and cheese were also scarce, and peanut butter wasn't as widely available in Canada at the time. But ketchup, cheap and shelf-stable, became a lifeline for desperate households. A slice of bread with ketchup spread across it was quick, easy, and, to children, just enough to feel like a sandwich. Wartime magazines even recommended it as a bright and tangy alternative when protein was unavailable. Why it mattered in Canada? The ketchup sandwich was more than just food, it was a symbol of making do with whatever was on hand. For mothers, it meant being able to pack something in a child's lunchbox without using precious rations. For children, it was often the only treat they could count on. In many working-class households, ketchup sandwiches became as common as porridge or stew. Looking back, many Canadians remember ketchup sandwiches with a mix of laughter and disbelief. Some recall them fondly, as a nostalgic taste of childhood. Others remember the disappointment of biting into one, longing for something more filling. To this day, older Canadians joke that ketchup sandwiches taught them the meaning of sacrifice, and the art of pretending something simple was something special. Of course, not all wartime meals were so bare. Some Canadians turned to raising their own food, and that meant dinners made from an animal once considered more pet than protein, the rabbit. Point number 10, beet marmalade. What if your morning toast was spread not with orange marmalade, but with something made from beets? For many Canadians in the 1940s, this unusual substitute became a breakfast staple. During World War II, citrus fruit was one of the hardest foods to find in Canada. Imported oranges, lemons, and grapefruits were scarce due to shipping disruptions and rationing. Without oranges, traditional marmalade disappeared from store shelves. To fill the gap, resourceful homemakers, and even some commercial producers, turned to local crops. Beets, with their natural sweetness and vibrant red color, became the foundation for mock marmalade. By adding sugar, vinegar, and a touch of flavoring, cooks transformed beets into a spread that resembled the look, and, with imagination, the taste, of orange marmalade. Why it mattered in Canada? For families, beet marmalade represented more than just thrift. It allowed Canadians to keep a sense of normalcy at the breakfast table. Spreading something bright and sweet on bread felt familiar, even if it wasn't quite the same as before. Government pamphlets encouraged such substitutions, reminding households that every creative recipe helped the war effort by reducing reliance on imports. But not everyone was fooled. Many children wrinkled their noses at the earthy taste of beets, wondering why their jam didn't taste like fruit. Some adults admitted they only ate it because there was no other choice. Yet others developed a fondness for the unique flavor, recalling it as a symbol of resourcefulness. Even today, older Canadians remember beet marmalade with a mix of nostalgia and disbelief, a strange reminder of how wartime scarcity turned ordinary vegetables into breakfast treats. And breakfast wasn't the only meal transformed by substitutions. Even the Sunday roast was reimagined, with a dish Canadians came to know as mock duck. Point number 11, mock duck, bread stuffed ground meat. On Sundays, many Canadian families still gathered for a roast dinner. But during the war, that roast duck on the table often had no duck at all. With fresh poultry scarce and expensive, families turned to substitutes. Mock duck was one such invention, a dish made by shaping seasoned ground meat, usually beef or pork scraps, into a loaf and stuffing it with breadcrumbs, onions, and herbs. The loaf was then tied, baked, and served much like a traditional roast. Cookbooks and government pamphlets promoted it as a thrifty alternative, reassuring homemakers that it could deliver the feeling of a special meal without using up precious ration coupons. Why it mattered in Canada? Mock duck mattered because it preserved tradition. The Sunday roast was more than just food, it was a ritual of family togetherness and stability. By serving mock duck, Canadians could maintain the illusion of a proper roast dinner, even when real poultry was far out of reach. It also stretched small amounts of meat, feeding larger families at a time when every scrap counted. For children, the experience was mixed. Some remembered mock duck fondly, as a hearty dish that brought comfort in uncertain times. Others recalled the disappointment of expecting roast poultry and discovering a dense loaf instead. For many households, it became a symbol of ingenuity, a reminder that even when the menu had to change, the tradition of sitting together at the table never did. But meat wasn't only stretched with bread. Another surprising filler made its way into countless Canadian dishes: plain old oatmeal. Point number 12. Oatmeal meat stretchers. Imagine sitting down to what you thought was a hearty meatloaf, only to find out half of it was actually oatmeal. During World War II, ground beef and pork were expensive and tightly rationed. To make limited meat portions go further, Canadian homemakers were encouraged by government pamphlets to stretch meat with inexpensive fillers. Oatmeal, cheap, filling, and widely available, became one of the most common. A handful of oats mixed into ground meat helped bind it together and bulk it up, creating dishes like meatloaf, patties, and casseroles that could feed more mouths for fewer ration points. Why it mattered in Canada. This wasn't just about saving money, it was about survival and morale. Families with several children could still enjoy meals that felt hearty, even if half the protein was replaced with oats. Oatmeal also absorbed flavor, making it a surprisingly versatile addition. For working-class households, this trick meant the difference between one night of meat and 3 nights of meals. To many post-war Canadians, the memory of oatmeal in their hamburgers or meat pies remains vivid. Some still cringe at the texture: chewy, soft, and not quite meaty. Others look back with nostalgia, remembering how their parents proudly made do with what they had. It may sound unappetizing now, but in those days, oats in your meatloaf were a quiet act of resilience. Of course, oats weren't the only creative way to replace missing ingredients. Sometimes, Canadians even remade desserts, swapping scarce sugar and cream for something far stranger: vegetables. Point number 13. Beetroot chocolate cake. What if I told you that one of Canada's most beloved desserts during the war contained a secret ingredient, and it wasn't sugar, butter, or even chocolate? It was beets. With sugar and butter heavily rationed, Canadians had to find clever substitutes in baking. Enter the humble beet. Home economists discovered that grated beets could add natural sweetness, moisture, and color to cakes. Beetroot chocolate cake quickly became a favorite in wartime kitchens, offering a rich, dark dessert that stretched precious cocoa while requiring far less sugar and fat. Community cookbooks and wartime recipe leaflets praised it as a thrifty treat that didn't feel like a sacrifice. Why it mattered in Canada. Cake was more than dessert, it was celebration, comfort, and a sense of normalcy. For birthdays, holidays, or even Sunday dinners, families longed for a little indulgence. Beet cake allowed homemakers to put something special on the table, proving that resourcefulness could bring sweetness into even the hardest times. It also encouraged Canadians to use garden produce in unexpected ways, reinforcing the grow-your-own spirit of the Victory Gardens. For many children of the era, this cake was both surprising and unforgettable. Some never realized they were eating vegetables hidden in their chocolate cake, while others could taste the earthy undertone and swore it wasn't real dessert. Today, the idea may sound bizarre, but to wartime families, beet cake was a little miracle. It was proof that joy could still be found, even when sugar bowls were nearly empty. And if vegetables could sneak their way into cakes, imagine what Canadians did with tea. In fact, tea became the base for an entire dessert of its own. Point number 14. Tea loaf. Imagine brewing a strong pot of tea, not to drink, but to bake with. During wartime in Canada, tea wasn't just a comforting beverage, it became the key to an unusual dessert known as tea loaf. Sugar, eggs, and fats were tightly rationed in the 1940s. Bakers had to get creative, and one trick was soaking dried fruits in leftover tea. The tea plumped up raisins and currants, while also adding depth of flavor. Mixed with just enough flour and baking soda, this produced a dense, rich loaf without the need for butter or milk. Community cookbooks and women's magazines circulated recipes for wartime fruit loaf or tea bread, praising it as inexpensive, filling, and adaptable to whatever dried fruits a family could spare. Why it mattered in Canada. The tea loaf was more than just food, it was tradition and comfort rolled into one. Families often served it sliced thin with a bit of margarine, or simply alongside a cup of real tea when guests visited. In many homes, it replaced more elaborate cakes that wartime restrictions made impossible. For Canadians with British heritage, the loaf carried nostalgic ties to England, reinforcing bonds across the Atlantic during a time of shared sacrifice. For children of the era, tea loaf could feel like both a treat and a disappointment. Sweet enough to count as dessert, but never quite the sugary cake they longed for. And yet, in today's world of abundance, many who lived through the war recall it with surprising fondness, a reminder of ingenuity, thrift, and the ability to make something special out of almost nothing. But tea wasn't the only pantry staple put to unusual use. In fact, one wartime Canadian dish turned a bowl of oatmeal into something entirely unexpected.